let my people go. This phrase is repeated again and again in this week's Parsha. Moses and Aaron go before Pharaoh on behalf of Am Yisrael to plead for permission to leave Egypt and wander the desert towards freedom. Moses is directed by God to go before Pharaoh and say, Shalach et ami, let my people go. Moses will approach Pharaoh 5 times in this week's Parsha, pleading, let my people go. However, as the plagues befall Egypt, Pharaoh's heart is hardened and he grows increasingly spiteful of Am Yisrael. Again and again is the story of our people, the Jewish people. Our story in Exodus, as retold in this week's Parsha, set the tone for our people as it still does to this very day. Our story of again and again has repeated itself for thousands of years. We suffered, we were victims. Again and again, ruthless tyrants deprived us of our humanity, our freedom, and our lives. But we also repeatedly stood up to pharaohs, tyrants, and demagogues. In our Parsha, Moses and Aaron do not go before Pharaoh once or twice. They go before Pharaoh again and again. They were persistent. They did not give up. They endured and prevailed. This is also the story of our people. One side of our story cannot be complete without the other. Again and again, we find ourselves shackled in bondage and oppressed. How and where does this story begin? Robert Wistrich, a critically acclaimed expert on anti-Semitism, suggested that the story of again and again begins in Egypt with this week's Parsha. Wistrich suggests in his book, Anti-Semitism, The Longest Hatred, that the most pervasive hatred, that of anti-Semitism, begins with a prevailing belief in Egypt as encapsulated in the 3rd century BCE by the Egyptian priest Manetho and the later Egyptian Greek Alexandrian Apion, who presented the Hebrews as a race of lepers who had been cast out of Egypt in the days of Moses. Wistrich describes the Egyptians as the first anti-Semitic polemists of antiquity. Egypt bore this hatred, Hellenization nursed it, misguided Christianity and Islam cradled it, and modernity raised it until adulthood. Looking into our own theology, however, what can we say or do when we are oppressed? Rabbi Kalman Shapiro preached on this subject from his pulpit inside the Warsaw Ghetto. He used the Jewish concept of hester panim, the shyness of God's face, to describe how and why our people's story of again and again has repeated itself. For Rabbi Shapiro, the author of Eish Kodesh, hester panim describes how catastrophes can happen. According to Rabbi Shapiro, God's desire to mourn the Shoah privately caused God to retreat during the Second World War. In the face of tragedy, God retreats. In Shapiro's very passive approach, human agency has very little to do with human catastrophe. Shapiro's philosophy and theology are that of a man who lost everything in the war. His beloved only son died in the Warsaw Ghetto. Shapiro had no more fight in him. He had no more tears to shed, no more blood to let. By contrast, in the Vilna Ghetto, Zelig Kalmanovich interpreted hester panim quite differently. Kalmanovich believed that God's absence during the war resulted from the Nazis' attack upon a sacred triad, the Torah, Israel, and God. However, Kalmanovich preached from the Vilna Ghetto, so long as Jews affirm their place in the sacred triad, we would prevail. The Germans could destroy one arm of the triad, our bodies, but they would never prevail if we affirm our faith in the Torah and moral law and the creator of the universe. His approach suggests a more active presence in our world. Kalmanovich's theology leads the way for the many post-Holocaust theologians who would propose, as Rabbi Louis Jacob once did, of holding on to the challenging parts of our identities, for instance, of chosenness or of obscure traditions, for the sheer sake of tactically disagreeing with our detractors. It serves a spiritual purpose. Our faith in Judaism in the Torah is a faith in persistence and in resistance. I find Kalmanovich's spiritual resistance inspiring. It's something I think about every time I lay tefillin, when I was at my son's bris, when I daven mincha. However, I want to take this one step further. I think that standing up means more than just putting on tefillin. Spiritual warfare can't be restricted or limited to ritual or theological observances. It means standing together with organizations resisting anti-Semitism. It means fighting back not with only our faith, but with our calls to action. Jewish history and this week's Parsha proves it. Again and again chronicles our heroic fight against evil and our confrontation against oppressors. Numerous Jewish organizations adopted the aphorisms of never again and never again is now. These organizations echoed the calls of our people heard for well over a millennium. Only a few decades ago, the call, "Let my people go," was used by Jewish organizations to call for the Soviet Union to free its Jewish captives from bondage. Facing the real possibility that the Soviet Union's Jews may be rounded up and sent away, Jewish groups across the globe, with the Holocaust fresh in their collective memory, loudly called out to say in unison, "Never again is now." This is the message of this week's Parsha. Moses and Aaron go before Pharaoh several times in this Parsha. Even after being dismissed, they continued to approach him. They did not give up, and they continued to stand against oppression. They spoke out and played active roles for our people. Because of them, we were ultimately redeemed from oppression. Again and again, ruthless tyrants have tried to deprive us of our humanity, our freedom, and our lives. Again and again, we have stood up against the tyrants of our people to say, "Never again is now." The moment we either throw up our hands and give up, or become complacent to sinat hinam and to anti-Semitism, is the moment we have forgotten our narrative of again and again. The moment we allow political discourse to interfere with our holy crusade against anti-Semitism is the moment we have lost our meaning to be a Jew. The moment we see our children's eyes roll at the words Holocaust or the Freedom for Soviet Jewry movement is the moment we have failed this mission. I fear my generation is failing at this holy endeavor. Anti-Semitism is again rising, and my generation is wholly unprepared for it. We don't have the firsthand knowledge of the Holocaust or expertise of the generations before us. As our community has become more diverse, fewer of us have direct familial connections to this history. As Jews, the battle of anti-Semitism is a battle we must all stand behind, but we can't. Many of us have internalized the narrative of Jewish victimhood while remaining wholly ignorant of the legacy of Jewish resistance. At the end of my Year in Israel program, I ran into Natan Sharansky on the streets of Jerusalem. When I saw him on the streets of Jerusalem, I hugged him and thanked him. My wife's family were all refuseniks. I told Sharansky that if not for his work, I would not be standing where I am today. After sharing this story with my classmates, many, starry-eyed, asked me, "Who is Natan Sharansky?" Brothers and sisters, I struggle to think of anyone who better embodies this week's Parsha other than Natan Sharansky. A refusenik, he was held captive in the Soviet Union and denied exit to Israel. He was imprisoned for 9 years in Soviet gulags because he would not be silenced about the Soviet Union's oppression of its Jews. While in prison, his wife, Avital, began a campaign for her husband's release under the banner, "Let my people go." From inside the Soviet gulags, visitors smuggled a book of Psalms to Sharansky, and he secretly began to write his memoir, "Fear No Evil." In his memoir, Sharansky wrote that the path to liberation could not be found in denying our own roots while pursuing universal goals. On the contrary, we had to deepen our commitment because only he who understands his own identity and has already become a free person can work effectively for the human rights of others. When we forget what our people have endured, we lose ourselves. It spells a recipe for complacency and the normalization of anti-Semitism, and this process has already begun. As I stand before my teachers and colleagues at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion today, we have an opportunity for our future. Your students need your guidance now more than ever. Now is not a time for partisan squabbling or discourse minimalizing the tragic rise in anti-Semitism. We need your support, and we need new initiatives to help our students deal with anti-Semitism. I call for a three-pronged approach for our community at HUC-JIR of Cincinnati. First, we need to better engage with other Jewish organizations in the Cincinnati area working to combat anti-Semitism. As far as I know, I am the last student who worked as a fellow at the Cincinnati's Holocaust and Humanities Center. This center must feel included at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, and we need to restore our fellowship opportunities with the Holocaust and Humanities Center. Beyond the Holocaust and Humanities Center, we also need to help organize and stand behind our brethren in the Orthodox community. They constitute the majority of victims of anti-Semitism in the United States. This community has felt immense animosity, and we need to reach out to them as an institution. Secondly, we must be clear with our students. Minimalizing anti-Semitism is unacceptable. Whether behind a computer or at a press conference for Cincinnati's major news stations, we cannot minimalize it. We cannot call swastikas painted on our school a minor incident. Our kishkas tell us otherwise, and we must listen to them. We cannot excuse anti-Semitism. Its ideology calls for the murder of Jews. It is pure evil. We must speak out and call it for what it is. Lastly, we need comprehensive education on anti-Semitism. Our Judaism and Christianity course explored some of this, but the course has currently been cut from our educational requirements. This course, or some equivalent, needs to be reinstated. The students need to know about the history of anti-Semitism. The students must know about the battles we have fought. The students should not be graduating without knowing who Natan Sharansky is. We need to clarify with our students that we should know about our people's struggles, when we were pushed and when we pushed back. We need to know about people like Natan Sharansky. If not for the freedom of Soviet Jewry movement, their fate could have been much worse. Instead, they were saved. We must talk about our people's persistence. Our mass exodus from Arab lands to the safety of Israel was another story that could have ended much differently, but they were saved too. When we discuss our narrative of again and again with our students, any generation's disconnect from our narrative must not be affirmed with a calming reassurance and presence. It alienates our victims and ourselves from our narrative's truth. As we have read today in our Parsha, our narrative shows that again and again a tyrant has risen up against us, and again we have prevailed. We've been called to stand up for our people today. We only prevail if we are persistent. We must not be complacent. We must not excuse anti-Semitism. We need an overwhelming voice to say, never again is now.